wife were both living and were not ashamed.
May God bless our hearing and receiving of those good words. Thank you so much, Dunstan, for reading that scripture. And good morning, everyone. As we look deeper at Genesis this summer, there is this invitation that Tim touched on earlier about how we recreate our world. Our spiritual narratives, such as this well-known garden seed, remind us that there was a time on earth when all was deemed good, and that goodness still resides deep into our souls. There are few American icons that inspire goodness like the television host, Mr. Rogers. Fred Rogers is actually a Presbyterian minister, and his television program changed the nation because it saw children as equally important co-learners in this neighborhood. And besides valuing the education of children, Fred Rogers also publicly was an advocate for justice and equality. He challenged racial segregation on his show in 1969 when Francois Clemens, a Black actor playing a police officer, and Mr. Rogers dipped their feet into a kiddie pool together. That was an acknowledgement to the civil unrest that was happening all over the country over racially segregated swimming pools. Our centering words from Mr. Rogers this morning may be familiar to some. When catastrophe strikes, look for the helpers. They will give you hope. And this year has given us many opportunities to admire the helpers among us, the nurses and doctors and essential workers that have kept our community together while apart. But this morning, the book of Genesis has a message for us about the helpers and truly how holy helping is. You may have noticed the translation of the text that Dunstan read for us this morning was slightly different than our usual reading. In the text, there were a few words that were transcribed with their Hebrew translations. Scholar Phyllis Tribble is one of the early American feminist theologians, and she challenged the patriarchal structures of the church, not from a power analysis, but from a scriptural analysis. So the translation that we took this morning builds a lot on Tribble's work. And in her analysis of this well-known text, a rereading of Genesis, God did not create a heterosexual man in the beginning. God created Adhem, an androgynous being of humankind. The Hebrew word Adhem means thing made of dirt, and it is used many other times in the Hebrew scriptures to just describe humankind in general. I'm going to have Alec pull up quickly a translation of the text so we can see this come alive on the page. So all of these highlighted yellow words here is the version of the human that Dunstan read. You see it in the first 3 paragraphs throughout the story. The human did this. The human tried to name the creation around him. And then it is only in the end of the text, I'll have you flip to the next slide, Alec, that these gendered terms, unfortunately classically in pink and blue, but they come in with God created the woman and God created the man. Only once this being of dirt is divided into two separate creations. So you could throw those down, Alec, but thanks for walking through that with me, because Tribble's analysis first debunks this myth that God made man first. It goes further to talk about how God made this second creature in a way that Mr. Rogers would be proud of. In that 8th verse, God claims, "It is not good that the human should be alone. I will make a helper fit for it." The Hebrew term helper here, ezer, is also not a subordinate term for an assistant, but a relational helper that asserts shared power. The real kicker here is that in Deuteronomy and Psalms, the same word for helper, ezer, is used to describe God. God is a helper of the people of Israel. God creates and saves and helps the beloved ones. The second being that God creates is like God, a helper. The words to describe helper are also important. It's not any sort of helper, but a helper who is fit for the human. Tribble connects this phrase to the term a helper who is a counterpart. In our human brokenness, the power structures that uphold our society often block us from truly being helpers who are counterparts. And this is why Mr. Rogers' programming was so powerful, because children were seen as beings with intelligence that could hold conversations and as full equals. Often in our society today, there are givers and receivers. There are the needy and the donatee. But by grounding our definition of help in Genesis, there is a version of humanity where, like God, we help each other as full equals and expect nothing in return. There is a version of help that is grounded in solidarity rather than charity. And this form of help rooted in solidarity does not come when we live with blinders on in isolation. To be a helper that is a counterpart means being an external witness to a pain that has occurred. This past week on Tuesday, May 25th, the nation commemorated the death of George Floyd. Members of Floyd's family, including his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna, met with President Biden, and there were visuals held across the country. And in the trial that convicted Derek Chauvin, the police officer that murdered George Floyd, there were 19 witnesses that took the stand. An off-duty firefighter, a trained EMT, store clerks, 911 dispatchers, and people who were passing by the scene that just wanted to help. 18-year-old Darnella Frazier, who filmed the video seen worldwide, and her 9-year-old cousin Judah became helpers when they were walking down the street. And Darnella's help did not save George Floyd's life, but her witness expanded his legacy. Today, helpers do come in the traditional forms of care that Mr. Rogers spoke of at tragic earth catastrophes, but there are helpers that come in other forms, like Darnella. There are helpers who are those that believe women The first time they say they have experienced a sexual assault. There are helpers who speak up during Zoom service sometimes, but also helpers that speak up when a coworker or family member drops a racist remark. And one important aspect around the conversation about defunding the police departments resides in this new definition of help as solidarity. Do police really help make communities more safe? Or does true help come in the form of mental health professionals or trained violence disruptors from within the community? Most people of color have learned the lesson: if you need help, you don't call the police. And more white communities are now taking this cue and imagining alternative security practices. In order to help the most vulnerable in our society, we must think deeply about the power assumptions of where that help comes from. One of the characteristics of observed white supremacy culture is individualism, thinking that we can do everything alone, internalizing that asking for help is a sign of weakness. Have you considered that by asking for help, you are actively combating white supremacy? Because helpers come when you are brave enough to ask, to acknowledge the deep toll isolation and unprocessed grief of the pandemic has had on our mental health, to ask someone to check in on you tomorrow because today you got through the day sober, but tomorrow's wait already seems like a test. When Mr. Rogers encouraged us to look for the helpers, it also means to look for God. And that is what God did in the Garden of Eden, is to create community, to create help. The same God that created the human and Adam and Eve and made those things good is the same God that we can call on for help today. I think of that funny anecdote where there's the man who's shipwrecked in the middle of the ocean and he calls on God for help. A fishing boat captain comes and waves and says, "Come on in, buddy. I'll bring you to shore." And the shipwrecked fella replies back, "No, God will save me." And then a submarine pops up and he gets rejected too. And a helicopter comes down and the man replies back, "God will save me." And then he drowns. And he gets to heaven and he yells at God for not helping him. And God replies back, "I sent you a fishing boat and a submarine and a helicopter, and you did not accept my gifts." The way that God's help, the way that God's gifts manifest in our life may be different than what we imagine. But the story of Genesis teaches us that remaining open to the giving and receiving of holy help may be the original purpose of why God put humans on this earth. And during this transitional time in our world, we're a bit like these first humans, peeking our heads out into a new world from behind our quarantined selves. We see this beautiful world out there that we're supposed to belong to, but perhaps we feel different. We feel scared. But as we re-enter this time of recreation, we need to look for the helpers and we need to receive help. And we need to magnify God's holy helping hands in all of the ways that we can, in all of the places that we can, for all of the people that we can. So may it be, and amen.